Welcome everyone. Good morning and welcome to the next of EMPA's free webinars. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gundungurra people in southern New South Wales. If you've attended an EMPA seminar previously or any other of our various online events using this platform, you should be familiar with the various controls and buttons on your screen. Just jump on the chat panel at any time to talk with the panelists and your fellow participants. Just be sure to have chat with everyone selected at the top of your chat window so everyone can see your comment. After the presentation today, there'll be a Q&A session. Type in your questions to the Q&A panel at any time during the webinar for the presenters to answer during the end discussion. If you have any issues or questions and can't access the chat, shoot us through an email at conferences@empa.org.au. Today's webinar is The Never-Ending Stream, Disaster Response in New York City from 9/11 to COVID-19. And your speaker today is Assistant Vice President, Emergency Management and Enterprise Resilience, Kelly McKinney, who joins us all the way from New York City. As the former Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Office of the Emergency Management and Chief Disaster Officer for the American Red Cross in Greater New York, Kelly's had a leadership role in every major emergency in New York City from the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks to the present day. Nationally known for his writings on the principles and practice of emergency management, his 5-minute video, The Essential Emergency Manager, has been viewed more than 100,000 times on YouTube. Currently, he is Assistant Vice President of Emergency Management and Enterprise Resilience at New York University, Laguna Health in New York. In the early morning after the 9/11 attacks, as the Associate Commissioner for Environmental Health at the New York City Department of Health, Kelly was assigned to the makeshift Emergency Operations Center in the second-floor library of the city's police academy on East 20th Street, 6 blocks above the evacuated city, the so-called Red Zone. He spent the 2 decades since in leadership roles in every major emergency in New York City. First as the Deputy Commissioner at the New York City Office of the Emergency Management, and then as the Chief Disaster Officer for the American Red Cross in New York. Bid him a very fond welcome, and thank you, Kelly, for giving up your time today, and over to you.
Good morning, Phil. Thank you so much. I apologize for that lengthy introduction, but it never sounded so good. I appreciate that, and I'm thrilled to be here talking emergency management with my colleagues from the great nation of Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, all over that great island nation. And I thank you for inviting me here. I think Tony and Adrienne and Bianca, and thrilled to be here. I'm a working emergency manager. In fact, we are currently activated for a early season nor'easter that is undergoing bomb genesis, which is a rapid deepening of low pressure and energy off the coast of New York. And so we're getting some heavy rains and high winds. And so I am not a professional speaker, and I've got notes and things, and I speak with my hands. So it will not be a super professional presentation, but hopefully it will be interesting to you. And in America, emergency managers have a phrase, we utter it often, almost like a mantra. And I'm pretty sure you say it in Australia too. It is all disasters are local. All disasters are local. And the idea that all disasters are local refers to the fact that local governments, and in America, there are some 30,000 of them across the country, they bear the primary responsibility for disasters. Now, we know that private citizens as individuals also bear some responsibility, but the boundaries are not always clear and they vary depending on where you are. Culture plays a huge role. Personal responsibility in San Antonio, Texas is a very different thing than personal responsibility in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, for instance. Another important phrase in our lexicon is own the job. And if for the sake of argument, we say that government is ultimately responsible for disasters, then emergency managers say it is our job to own the disaster. Ownership in this case means accountability. It means taking the initiative even without full accountability for the process or the outcomes. Those who own the disaster must be willing to face the consequences that come with failure. That is what emergency managers do. When everybody else runs away from the disaster, they must run at it. And over the past 20 years, we have run at dozens, even hundreds of disasters, from the October 2001 anthrax attacks to the Flight 587 disaster, to the 2010 Christmas blizzard, to the Lexington Avenue steam pipe explosion, to heat waves and tower crane collapses and earthquakes and hurricanes. This period was a unique time for us and for New York, as a never-ending stream of disasters taught us powerful lessons. I'm going to try to provide some of those lessons here this morning to you. But I warn you, some of it is going to sound strange, even alarming. And I invite your feedback, your thoughts, and your criticisms to my way of thinking, because it's not as if I'm right. In fact, I'm subject to enormous biases. For instance, I'm the poster child for the recallability bias. That is, I'm overly influenced by my past experiences, especially the one that occurred on a brilliant crystal blue autumn morning in September 2001, when I emerged from the subway station at Church and Chambers Streets, just as I had nearly every day for the prior 10 years, into a world that was utterly unfamiliar. Instead of hustle and movement, cars and people were stopped, frozen in place. Everybody was looking up. So I looked up too. And I didn't believe my eyes. It felt unreal, like being in a movie. Many people have experienced the first minutes of a major disaster. Some describe a strange feeling like a plunge into chaos. Others talk about a sense that they're looking down at themselves from above. That's just their mind sensing the change, because if there's one thing that I've learned since that day, it is that in the early hours of a major disaster, everything is different. We are cast out of our orderly and familiar reality into a new one that is anything but. That new reality is not just a variation on the theme of everyday life. It's not just some fast-moving time, one end of the spectrum with daily life being the other. The disaster is fundamentally different. It's a parallel universe. And unlike our ordered and sometimes rational world, in the parallel universe, chaos and confusion reign. The normal rules of logic, even the basic ones like cause and effect, don't apply. It's a strange place, so strange that it's difficult to describe. But to get there, you need to leave this ordered and rational world and travel into a new one to face the raging monster that is the crisis. It could be anything, widespread and all-encompassing, like a tornado slamming into a rural farm town, or focused and devastating, like a white supremacist with an assault rifle attacking a church during Sunday service. Whatever kind or variety of crisis you find in the parallel universe, it's useful to understand what the crisis is not. The crisis is not an incident. It's not a concept. It is not inanimate. It is not random, and it is not benign. It is a being with thoughts and intentions. None of its thoughts are good, and all of its intentions are bad. The crisis is a dragon that must be slayed because it wants to destroy you. Most normal people are in denial about all of this. We say that they live their lives behind a brick wall of hope. That brick wall exists in the minds of every normal person because it's human nature, but it's a different story for us, for emergency managers, because We have that brick wall, but in spite of it, we can't use it to block out the bad stuff, because that dragon behind that brick wall, that is our adversary. The disaster zone is our world. We get paid to occupy that world, to enter it, and to do battle with the crisis. It is our job to overcome the complacency and to always think and act with the worst case scenario in mind. The most important lesson we learned in 20 years in the disaster business in New York City is that the biggest challenge in the disaster business is not money or aging infrastructure or even climate change. Our biggest challenge is that 6-inch space between our ears. That is the real ground zero. That is where the complacency begins. That is also where the devastation happens. I'm just going to read a blog that I came across last week, and maybe it'll resonate with some of you. Today is the last day of Victoria's 6th lockdown, the worst one since the worst one. 78 days and no longer counting. More significantly, it is potentially the last day of lockdown in Melbourne, period. From this distance, none of us can properly comprehend the depth of the wounds gouged into Victorian minds, bodies, and souls over the 263 days of hard lockdown. A relentless assault of nothing. Countless lives have been saved by our isolation, by the severed connections and missed moments, by the endless days that evaporate into mist and leave nothing behind. But it has been hard. It has been a lot. Most locked down city in the world isn't just a Murdoch headline. It's a thing that actually happened here, home, a prolonged opportunity to bond with our demons and existential crises. 6.5 million people giving as much as possible for as long as possible on behalf of the other 6.4999999 million. To put this as bluntly as possible, these past 20 months have really sucked for lots and lots of people. That's the devastation. And as emergency managers try to overcome that, to master that 6-inch piece of gray matter, we have evolved a unique emergency management approach. It's a way of thinking, it's a mindset. And everything I say here this morning is going to try to reflect that mindset. For us, it's a fierce mindset for that fierce world, one that helps us to overcome that voice in our heads that says, turn around and run away. The mindset tells us instead to step up, to get into that ring and start punching, to start thinking just when clear, rational thinking becomes the hardest thing in the world. Because when everybody else loses it, we have to be the calmest people in the room. The Brits and the Aussies evoke this with their stiff upper lip self-discipline, which popular culture has rendered into that national virtue and character trait. That's where keep calm and carry on comes from. In the parallel universe, some people step down and some step up, but most just freeze, trapped in crisis mode. The ones you need are the ones who step up, the natural crisis leaders, but these are rare beasts. You can find them there, but you can't be sure that you will. So we must be the crisis leaders every time. We have to know this place, the parallel universe. We can't start to figure it out every time. We have to know what to expect. We know that we'll have to think not only for ourselves, but for everyone else too. And even back here in the normal world, when we're not in the middle of the crisis, we're the ones who have to be constantly reminding normal people that it's there. It's right there and it's coming. We have to answer the questions that nobody else can answer. We have to imagine the things that nobody else can see. We have to solve the problems that nobody else can solve. And to me, that's the value that we bring. For us, in the US anyway. That's one of our biggest problems as an industry, because everywhere you look, you'll see an emergency management department that is under-resourced. But in many ways, that's our own fault, because we are abysmally bad when it comes to justifying our existence. We are our own worst enemy. We cannot explain to the boss or the budget director why what we do is important. We cannot articulate our value proposition. For me, our value proposition is execution. So I want to talk about that for a second in the context of the COVID response and my team. Actually, just a piece of it, because, you know, in many ways, we are still in the job. But for us, that first wave in the spring of 2020 was a discrete event that we've had an opportunity to review as a classic surge incident. Several factors, all of which were executed by a diverse team of stakeholders from across my enterprise, were involved in what we consider to be a successful response. Our medicine, our nursing, our infection control, hospital operations, regulatory facilities engineering, all came together to completely remake our hospitals in real time. All 6 hospitals became coronavirus intensive care units, literally overnight. We also, that team also enabled a nimbleness of staffing postures that allowed us to get the right person in the right place at the right time. So what did we do? Emergency management doesn't provide patient care. Our role is secondary, but it does bring value. For evolving incidents, it consists of our incident management overlay that alters the speed at which information is gathered and decisions are made. We are always keeping watch for threats. We're sizing up those threats for their potential impacts. When we see a threat with a potential impact, we're notifying everyone with an ownership stake in that problem. We activate a crisis team and we lead that team through emergency operations until the incident is resolved. But for this incident in particular, we believe our greatest value above all else was the emergency management mindset that we brought to the job. This is a timeline that is very difficult to read, and I don't expect that you can, but one thing of note is how it is skewed to the right. There's a lot, the left side of that graph is January, and the midpoint is March. And you see there, we did not receive a patient until the 5th of March, although we saw that virus out in central China in January. So we did not sit back and wait. We used the gift of time that China gave us during that initial lockdown in January and February. We were keeping watch. And as soon as we saw what was happening in Wuhan, we acted with that reasonable worst case expectation. We initiated a number of tasks early to activate our enterprise around this threat. To us, this was the most important phase of the incident before we got our first infectious patient on March 5th. We were thinking 3 steps ahead to be ready. We convened all of the levels of our enterprise to signal that the incident, although seemingly far off, was in reality a serious threat. In the face of an unpredictable crisis, instead of waiting, we used the gift of time. We put ourselves in the job. We put ourselves in Wuhan to size it up. And our nimble organization learned and evolved constantly. This is another difficult graph to see, but it really shows the layered organization chart that we have to master. You see at the top there, what we call the strategic level. That's the dean, the CEO, the trustees, what we call the executive leadership group. That's where decisions are approved. At the bottom is the tactical level. That's where, that's nurses on patient floors and researchers in laboratories. That's where the real work gets done. And between them is that blue layer. That's what we call the ops level. That's departments. And that's the layer that enables that action. And we sit in the middle. That's that red layer, the emergency operations center. And our operations look like this. And I'm not sure if the planning P is part of your lexicon, but it really has to do with us identifying issues, obstacles, unmet needs at that tactical level, 24 hours a day. We solution them in the EOC. We get those approvals, we get the resources we need from the strategic level, and we bring it back down through huddles and execute those workflows, those changed workflows around the clock. That really is that nimbleness. That's that op tempo. Organizations do this all the time. They just do it very slowly. We had to do it, and we have to do it in an instant, in minutes instead of days and weeks. In my book, Moment of Truth, I tell the story of Matt Metier, the New Orleans Deputy Emergency Preparedness Director, as he navigates through the chaos of his dimly lit emergency operations center on the 9th floor of the city's chief administrative offices in downtown New Orleans on the morning of August 30th, 2005. I tell this story because, having managed the New York City Emergency Operations Center for dozens of disasters, I know that the local EOC is the epicenter of every catastrophe. And in those early days after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, the New Orleans EOC was the busiest place on earth. Matt Metier and his team struggled with a multitude of issues in those early days. But where was the help? Where was the cavalry when New Orleans needed it? FEMA was there. FEMA had deployed its emergency response team to the state of Louisiana's Emergency Operations Center, but it was unable to combine forces with the state. In a similar way, the state was unable to combine forces with the city of New Orleans. And so in those crucial early hours, when we needed to get big enough, fast enough to manage the surge in human needs that the crisis brought, there were several response organizations working in parallel, all but disconnected. Unfortunately for the affected community, the seniors, the individuals with disabilities, children and families, government was essentially flat-footed. Those who own the disaster must be willing to face the consequences that come with failure. That is what governments must do. When everybody else runs away from the disaster, it must run at it. It is ultimately responsible and accountable for what gets done and what doesn't get done. So with that in mind, let's talk about another big job, one that is slightly nearer and dearer to us. And that's the same question. Who led the coordination for the United States response to the coronavirus crisis? Who made us feel like we were all in the same boat and rowing in the same direction? Because that parallel universe is our world, and navigating through it is our job, despite the physical transformation that takes place, despite the hardships that we encounter there, despite the confusion and the fear and the chaos. We have to be functional and effective from the instant we step inside it, because that is our job. But we have a problem. We call it the speed to scale challenge, and it remains our biggest problem. For people like me in the disaster business, it means failure and humiliation. And for the affected community, the seniors, the disabled, and the access and functional needs population, the children and families, it means suffering. Because human needs cannot wait, we have to be able to do nothing less than everything all at once. Because the crisis surges, we must surge too. We need to get big enough, fast enough to manage a tsunami of issues in the early hours. So at this point, the normal people listening are asking themselves, well, how do you do that? And here we have a number of names for it. We call it NIMS, the National Incident Management System, ICS, and there are a lot of skeptics here, especially after COVID. But any way we do it, for me, it's all about convening an incident organization. It's a coordination overlay that connects everyone together. It connects agencies and operational teams together in the Emergency Operations Center, to decision makers in the briefing room, to the first responders and relief workers on the ground. But we can't stop there because many in my business think that's enough. They think it's our job. Turn on the EOC. All we have to do is turn it on and get all those butts in those chairs and magic will happen. Well, I have another word for magic. OCHA, the Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance in the United Nations, says that coordination saves lives. Magic will happen if I, the emergency manager, lead the coordination in the form of 3 very simple tasks: manage information, manage resources, and manage consequences. And in a catastrophic disaster, it's hard to overstate the difficulty of even one of these tasks, let alone all 3. So here we are. How do we get big enough, fast enough to manage that spike in demand? Because we own it. We own the disaster, and we don't need a new organizational model. We just have to get better at scaling it and bringing it. Our job is to provide effectiveness, to commit and deliver for every type of disaster. Our job is to own the people issues. We have a responsibility to protect our most vulnerable citizens, our children, seniors, our people with disabilities. That is our moral obligation. We must always and everywhere convey an intimate understanding of their situation. Every message to them must include a detailed picture of what they're seeing, feeling, thinking, and experiencing. But the landscape is changing right out from under our feet. Our role is to create order out of chaos, but the chaos is growing. Even back here in this ordered world, the crisis managers are in crisis. In academia, in social media, in our offices and operations centers, about how to move our profession into the future and what direction that future lies. These are diverse voices and they're so important. And I'm adding my voice to that debate, but it's just that, it's just a voice and not a particularly diverse one at that. But in my view, our mission space is no longer just the field with its defined boundaries and command post and incident commander. It's much more complicated than that. Disaster zone occupies a parallel universe in the physical world, but also a parallel universe in the mind. And the devastation there, the issues and problems are in some ways even more vast. I'd like to say that we're just coming to grips with them, but I'm not sure that we are. As the outlines of the outlines of the end of the emergency phase of the pandemic starts to emerge off in the distance, experts are anticipating a long-term impact on people's mental health. For some people, the feelings of anxiety and depression that emerged during the pandemic will resolve, but many will face new or worse mental health issues that persist or even appear down the road. A number that can be quite large given the magnitude of despair and disruption. That burden, however big, stands to put an even greater strain on an already stretched mental health system. In the best of times, there is untreated mental illness, but with this pandemic, the entire world is affected. And as we know, our frontline workers are at particular risk because of their repeated exposure to trauma and traumatic events, including death. For mental health conditions, including PTSD, for which they too often don't seek help. First and foremost, from my perspective, are the frontline healthcare workers, the real tip of the spear. They've been in the trenches of the coronavirus pandemic for 20 months, and they're hurting with a high prevalence of stress, burnout, secondary traumatic stress due to the nature of their work. And yet they show a remarkable resiliency every single day. My organization, NYU Langone Health, recognizes the need for creative strategies to support the emotional well-being of our healthcare workers. And we provide a multitude of overlapping support programs, including internal and external mental health, emotional and spiritual support services, including a program called Code Lavender. And yet I feel like we are just scratching the surface. There are some good examples of best practices that we can model to continue to make progress. Susan McKenzie and the Emergency Services Foundation focuses on the mental health and well-being of first responders and does this through a range of services and research and by fostering innovation and best practices. In the UK, the police treatment centers support first responders through inpatient treatment centers where police officers can receive treatment for stress-related conditions or anxiety and depression as part of its psychological well-being program. In New York City over the past 20 years, emergency managers have done battle with so many crises, from terror attacks to blizzards to heat waves to hurricanes to pandemics. And over that period of time, we have developed a mindset, a way of thinking that sounds strange to normal people. But that's because emergency managers are not normal people. I, in particular, am totally not normal. I'm a professional worrier. I'm a catastrophist. I'm hypersensitive to any issue, the slightest hint of risk. I get that whiff of dread. I start to feel the social fabric giving way. My basic worldview is that we're all packed together onto a gigantic beer truck, careening downhill toward the flashing red lights of a railroad crossing. So I can feel that place that's right there beside me, beside all of us, but hidden by the flimsiest of gauzy membranes. The slightest tremor can push us through that gauzy membrane and into that dreadful place. Because there are no rules there. There are no political boundaries there. There are only questions with no answers. Who's in charge? Where is the cavalry? Who will help the seniors, the individuals with disabilities, the children and the families who are trapped there? We need to know that. We need to know what will happen, who's going to do it, and where they're going to get all the stuff they will need. Because the nature of the catastrophe that is soon to come is that it will start suddenly and with great intensity, with the biggest problems and greatest needs coming in its earliest hours. Those early hours, the so-called golden hours, will be a time of maximum chaos, and the actions we take then will determine our fate. I want to thank all of my great friends and colleagues in that amazing place of Australia, and thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or criticisms, comments, words of encouragement.
Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation today. We do indeed have a couple of questions. So the first question comes from Shahan. How do you go about defining a crisis for an organisation? One organisation's crisis will be just another organisation's business as usual. So what's the key element for declaring a crisis? Is it span of control, risk assessment, or span of impact?
That's a great question. And, you know, it's I guess my only thought to that is that lots and lots of people in my business search for triggers. They want qualitative or quantitative descriptions of when they need to act. And in my experience, those are very hard to come by. The only thing that I have ever had any success with is what we call watch and size up. And what that means is that you have human beings engaging that issue together in discussion and reviewing all of those things and together deciding, A, what is the worst case with this issue over all those different aspects that you mentioned, Phil. And B, do we need to act? Do we need to activate? Do we need to gather representatives from across our organization to to respond. So there's no clear answer except that you need to put your eyes on it. You need to put your thinking to it, and in combination with others.
Next question is from Barbara Ryan, who asks what the motivation was for your latest book.
So I have a book that is actually in print, and then I have a book that is halfway to being in print, and it's called Epicenter. This is the new book, and it is about that that coronavirus crisis, that first wave. It is really the story of that first wave, and so the discussion that I presented is really, if you take those 5 slides or however many slides that were, that's the book. But it really tells the story of that and how we did that, how we anticipated, how we thought worst case, and how we really dragged the organization kicking and screaming into the job. But it's the same everywhere you go. You know, it's amazing that human beings are in denial, and they'll say no, 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 and they'll, to everything you say, let's do this, let's do that, no, no, no. Then the job happens, and their mind gets changed, and they're doing these things, and then in the aftermath they'll tell you, oh, I was there all the time with you. I was the one advocating that we act. So in the aftermath, people perceive their actions differently. It's a strange phenomenon.
Thank you. Another question from Shahan Ritzwi is there a difference between incident management and crisis management, and what's the step change to crisis? Is it a loss of control?
I think it is, to an extent, yes. It is, and that is I think the human aspect of it. That is what human beings feel, and that's where their anxiety sets in. That's where their confusion sets in. Is that loss of control and that loss of order, that sense of order, and that they have over their lives. It's very important. But incidents and crises, to me, the only difference is that an incident has a cause, and if part of your crisis management is to mitigate the cause, then to me that's incident management. And crisis management can be anything. You can be a participant in a larger incident, but not responsible to mitigate it. And, so for instance, and this is pretty common in New York. In one example, there was an active shooter incident in a hospital in the Bronx a couple of years ago, and this doctor came in and with a rifle and started shooting people. The quintessential American active shooter incident. And that caused, that was an incident, that was crisis management for us, because we had to communicate. We had to talk to our people, and we had to mitigate the impacts of that. There were no safety issues, there were no security issues for our people, but that devastation was happening in their minds.
Next question's all the way over in New Zealand from Michelle Poole, who asks, hi Kelly, can you give a couple of examples of where effective public information management has contributed to a good outcome in an emergency response, and where the lack of it had a detrimental impact?
I can. I actually can. And I think that that question, being from being from New Zealand, I think is perfectly appropriate, because I think the New Zealand Prime Minister is an example of the latter, which is effective public information, effective crisis communication, effective risk communication. And our former president is an example of the former, which is ineffective public communication / crisis management. I mean, the thing, I'm 20 years in this business in New York. We had a very, very strong culture around public communications and how we communicate to the public during a crisis and what we say. And that is really shared. It's widely shared. We do the same things in Australia, New Zealand, but the Trump administration broke all those rules just one by one by one, and it was just painful to watch. I remember there was an early speech from the White House early in the first wave, and for us that was a milestone. We said, here it is. This is where the president gets on and rallies the country and models the fear that we're all feeling, and this is where I'm going to start to feel better about this thing. And that's exactly what didn't happen. I mean, all he did was talk about how great everything was going and how this thing was going to go away, and we all left it just absolutely devastated, because it was just the worst example of risk communication that you can even imagine. I'm very happy to say I think the White House is back to a bit of sanity. They're actually pretty good at this business now.
Next question, Kelly, comes from David Parsons, who asks, Kelly, many great points. Increasing risks from climate change in a tightly interconnected world are increasing the complexity of our disasters. What do you think are the top actions our industry should be taking to meet these exponentially rising challenges?
David, that's a great question, and I really think that the industry, we have a couple of jobs, and one of them is to understand our doctrine and our execution better collectively, and to connect together, connect each other. And here in the United States, there are 50 states. Each of them is its own political fiefdom, and those state directors of emergency management know each other, but they are not one team. And so that's the reason for my book. That's the reason for a lot of what I said here today, is that those 50 state emergency managers, it's their job to put those governors in a position where they can cooperate and they can work together in a crisis. And it's not happening right now. So it's our job to enable that kind of national system to come together, and we're not doing it.
Question from Mal McCann, who says, how do you keep people with limited emergency response mentality constantly working at risk mitigation and preparedness, thinking when there's not been an impacting event for some time? In other words, how do you combat complacency?
Yeah, it's the toughest challenge we have. And, I think there's already complacency setting in around infectious disease, believe it or not. And it really is a huge challenge. I mean, what we do is we create these events that are richly detailed, evocative exercises, and we throw people into them and really scare the heck out of them. We really try to we don't let them talk about what they would do and here is our plans, and our plan says we're going to do. We say, no, you're there. Don't say what you would do. Just say it. Don't tell me don't tell me your plan. I want you to act as if, and this is happening. We try to get them to engage that simulation, and that is for us is one technique. And people walk out of those a little clearer and with a bit less of that brick wall in their minds.
Andrew Lilly, Kelly asks, the fear with a crisis like COVID is the duration. As a first responder, you lose the ability to perform your role as you cannot police without the support of the community. How has New York dealt with this, and how do you get the community back on side?
Yeah, another terrific question, and I don't know that we've dealt with it quite that well. Tony Poole was talking about the karma that was sort of a presence in Australia during these lockdowns, and the fellowship that, and I don't want to overstate it because I wasn't there, and maybe people are cringing, right? But I think that that sense of community is so important, and we have it here, obviously, certainly outside New York. New York is a strange beast, obviously it's a unique place. But I think that sense of community has definitely suffered. And again, I just, I'm not political. If you take the left-right political spectrum, the liberal conservative political spectrum, and you split it right down the middle, you get 50.000. I mean, I'm right there. I could care less about any of that, either side of it. I'm there to try to, all I want is that I don't have to go to work because you people are screwing things up, right? That's really it for me. So I see, so I say something that's going to sound political, but it's not. But I think the way that the communication came out of the White House over the 4 years of the Trump administration has really degraded that sense of community in this country. So it is leadership. It's a leadership issue. And I think that really is what it boils down to. And it boils down to that for emergency management as well. One of our big problems in the United States is there's just, we have this national organization called FEMA. And in my view, and they've heard it from me before, they don't take a leadership role. They're not the ones that are convening the nation. And the nation can't convene itself. So we're going to struggle with that. So to me, it's leadership, it's communication. People you have to appeal to the angels that are inside all of us, because that devil is there too. And if you're like Donald Trump and you try to pull it out with every chance you get, well, you're going to have those results. You're going to pull it out, and we're seeing that outcome here.
The next question is very much along the same vein from John Jugam, who's asking, emergencies are always overlaid with political leadership, as you've just been saying. Not always good. What lessons have you learned that are useful for the pre-emergency environment?
The pre-emergency environment is that challenge of complacency, as you said, and it is so difficult because we are just immersed in the day-to-day, just getting through our daily lives. There's not room for preparedness. There's an interesting. I was at this Harvard course, and one day they put a Harvard professor in front of us that was an expert in public surveys. He was he did most of his business with political polling, but he also did other types of research, and he did a lot of research on preparedness programs, emergency preparedness, disaster preparedness programs that government does. We have many of them here. We have one called ready.gov, and we have Red Cross has one called Be Red Cross Ready. And we're always telling the public, get your go bag and have your plan and have these supplies in your home and make a plan and all this stuff. And so he put all these charts and graphs, and it was like he went on and on and on, and the data and this. But all I remember is the last thing he said, which was, he said, "We have concluded through our research that most of these preparedness programs are wasted effort." And what he means by that is that people are not doing it. They're just not. And why? Because they don't have time, they don't have money. If it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon, they're going to go make a disaster plan. Not just no, but hell no, they're not doing that, right? And so we imagine that people are doing that, and they're not. And so that's on us. So getting people to prepare in the absence of a disaster is the most difficult thing. He did point to a couple of populations that do prepare. He pointed to the Mormons, for instance. The Mormons are preppers. They're great preparers, and that's a cultural thing. He also said that the other population that they have found that does prepare are people who themselves have been directly impacted by a disaster. And he said, I'm not talking about someone whose house next door was destroyed because they weren't directly impacted. But if their house was destroyed, they are incentivized and they will prepare. That's what it takes. That's how hard it is. So the only people that are listening to you telling them to prepare are the people who are going to prepare whether you tell them or not. So that's where we are. And so again, I think it's all about what we do. and making sure that we can connect in the moment.
Thanks, Kelly. The next question comes from Kim Palmer, who says, amazing presentation. What strategies can be utilised to get people or organisations who act as impediments out of the way? For example, those who tell you the sky is not falling and it will be okay.
I love it. I love it. I love it. You know, and that is so tough. You know, one of the biggest, well, again, so to take this concept that this 6 inches is really the you know, the vast wasteland that we have to master. That's 6 inches between your ears. And for emergency managers, you know, it's all about that voice, that inner voice that's talking to us. And it's, and 99% of the time it's lying to you. And one of the things that it'll say to you is that, you know, you don't be alarmist. Do not be alarmist, because if you walk into the boss's office, or you walk into that conference room with all the executives of your organization, and you say that something bad is going to happen, your credibility is going to go out the window. You're going to be labeled an alarmist, and nobody's going to listen to you anymore. And that, my friends, is crap. Okay, because your job is to be an alarmist. You get paid to be a catastrophist. You get paid to be a pessimist. You're not paid to be an optimist. They're all optimists, okay? Just know that, right? Especially if you're in a private concern, that the people that build a business, a private business, especially entrepreneurs, they see opportunities. They see benefits. They don't see risks. They're blind to risks. So you have to go in there with the risks. And if they kick you out, so be it. They'll kick you out, and then the job will happen. And they'll be like, where did that person, where did they go? Get them back in here. We got work to do.
Next question comes from Louise Scott. A lot of the programs around seem to focus on first responders. Louise is interested to hear any insights or programs that you're aware of that focus on those in recovery roles.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. You know, I tell you, I think Australia is ahead of the curve on this. They're certainly ahead of us. I tell a story here. I was at Tony's conference in Melbourne. I guess it's now almost 3 years ago, and I gave a speech very like this one. In fact, it was probably verbatim of this speech that I just gave. You probably all just heard it again, because I'm not very, you know, I'm predictable. But so the speech was over, everybody left, and you're sitting there in that big room by yourself, and you're like, well, I'm like, well, maybe I should wander into a session. Let me wander into a session. So I wandered into this packed room, huge room, and you know, I found myself a seat in the middle, and there was this man up at the podium, big guy. You know, he was, I don't know, 6.5 feet tall, you know, 300 pounds. He was a senior constable, and he was talking about himself, and he was talking about his life. And it wasn't a pretty story. You know, he had been in trouble, and he had been in some bad spots, both professionally and at home. And he was getting very personal with what he was saying to people, and he was getting emotional, and at one point he started to tear up and even cry. And I have to say, I'm a person of my age. I was uncomfortable, so I'm trying to figure out how to get out of this room. I'm looking around, and I thought, you know, those people just saw me at this speech. If they see me leaving, I'm going to be sending this bad. So I had to sit there. I'm trapped in this room with this guy, and he went on and on and on, and then. But he talked through it, and at the end, I became transfixed with what he was saying, and I saw at the end he talked about it, and luckily the story got better. But he really was a witness. You know, he was testifying, he was talking about himself, he was opening up, and what he was doing is he was giving everybody in the room permission to do that too. And he talked about that. He talked about the fact that he, at his organization, is the person that people come into the office and close the door and do that to him, you know, and it was amazing. It was an amazing experience for me. And I think that to me, that's when I decided that, you know, the Aussies have something here. And I obviously you're all thinking, well, you know, that I might have been uncomfortable there too. So I'm not sure it's this universal thing, but it was definitely for me such a great piece of insight that a gift that I got from you. And I've been talking about that because I think that we all have to do it. We all have to do it. And if you think about police officers, can't do that. This was a police officer. This was a constable. Here in New York, police officers, if they do that, they're going to get their badge taken away. They're going to get their gun taken away. Their careers could be ruined, you know. And that's why there was a suicide epidemic here. You know, you see these horrible things day after day after day, things that people never want to see in their whole life. You know, they can't get it out if they see it once, and this cop sees it twice a month. You imagine the devastation that's there, and you have to get it out some way. And so testifying, I think, is at least a start. And I'm sure I didn't answer your question. So
the next one comes from Tina Van Winden, who says, we often work as emergency managers as outsiders, helping others, but the pandemic feels different because everyone is working in emergency management is personally impacted by the emergency in some way. Is there something that has been done differently during the pandemic to help me manage this?
You know, the only thing that was done, the only thing that, well, I'll tell you, for us in the United States, you know, the after action reports have yet to be written. And I think maybe some of them are written, they're not putting them out, but it's not a pretty story. And I've seen some Canadian reports that are very honest, you know, and that doesn't surprise me. They're very upfront and they're very honest about what went right and what went wrong. And some of them you could just change the name, you know, to any town or any state in the United States, and that because that's their story as well. But for me, it really was coming to work, and we, you know, my team, we came to work every single day, 7 days a week, and I think in some ways that saved us. You know, that it was hard, and I'm still not fully recovered from it, but having to work instead of being home, I think seemed to make it go better for us.
We're coming up to time on, are you happy to keep going for a few more questions, Kelly?
You know, if I'm sure, you know, yeah, if you are, I'm sure you're all sick of hearing my voice, but so sure, a couple more questions.
Sure. The next one comes from Ben Gordon, who says, hi, Kelly, really interesting presentation and thank you. What are your thoughts around moving outside the traditional methods of emergency management, looking at bottom-up, top-down integration of preparedness and response with a focus on community capacity and resilience?
I think it's essential. I think it's absolutely, in 2021, it's the question is, how can we not be doing that now? And, you know, and I think the answer is that we don't have the bandwidth to make it happen. There's just not enough. You know, the people in this business, in the emergency services business, they're fully engaged. So I think that's a great insight, and it really has to do with that community resilience from the bottom up, right? Just like the tactical level, that's where the work gets done. So start there.
The next one's a short question, but it's a pretty big one. Kelly, this is from Tony Pierce. Any thoughts on managing community need and, importantly, community expectation?
You know, I think you have to talk, and you have to keep talking, and you have to communicate and over communicate. I mean, you know, we had a governor in maybe even you've heard of Andrew Cuomo. Maybe some folks there have heard of Andrew Cuomo, but he was somebody who got in front of the camera and started talking every day for long conversations, saying everything he knew, everything he didn't know, what was happening, what wasn't happening, when those things would happen, and that really built a connection with people. There's examples also. There are examples of dictators doing that too, right? I think Hugo Chavez and others would get on TV and talk and talk and talk. So there's a risk there, right? You don't want, you could veer into totalitarianism or something. So yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance.
The next question, we'll just do a couple more, Kelly, is from Vicky Wright, who says, being constantly in response mode prevents planning and mitigation strategies from continuing due to minimal staff in this field, as you mentioned previously. Do you have any strategies for managing business as usual while being in response mode?
The questions are so important. So that's such a good question, and it really is our biggest challenge. It is that bandwidth. How do we prepare when we're, we do all kinds of different trainings and exercises and across this enterprise, and it all came to a screeching halt during coronavirus, and now we're just getting back on track. So there just isn't a good answer for it. I think it's about bandwidth. It's about communicating that value proposition and getting the budget people to support building bigger teams, right? And so if we execute in the job, we execute outside the job. There's a recognition of that value that we're bringing to the organization, and so that value begets funding, and it's like we create a virtuous cycle. We don't have that now, not here.
Jason Van Doren asks, could you provide some insights in relation to how the US is dealing with disaster or emergency fatigue amongst responders and agencies? Here in Australia, particularly in the eastern states, we've had a long fire campaign, 2019-20. We've had significant flood campaigns in some parts of the eastern state, and now we've had COVID.
I remember when I was in Australia, I was talking about, the fact that you'd had multiple long fire seasons and hurricanes, and it just seems to be one thing after another. We also have that problem, but luckily for us, we have those state impacts. So if we have wildfires, in California and Oregon, and then we have, another issue in another state, at least we have it's spread out to some extent, but I don't have good advice for that. And I think that's something we should all sort of, get together and work on.
Okay, Kelly, we might just go for another couple of questions and then finish up. And we thank you for giving up your time so generously today. A question from, sorry, I've lost that one. Just give me a sec. This is from Stephanie Davies, who says, in some parts of Australia with COVID response actions that were taken, case numbers have been kept quite low. To her, this seems like an example of taking relatively good actions and managing a crisis relatively well. Now the rhetoric is that the actions weren't needed because the crisis didn't happen, but it didn't happen because of the actions taken. So you've got a cyclical problem. How do you manage that kind of story?
It's a failed narrative. It's the wrong narrative. I was in an exchange with Andrew Tupper about this, and we were talking about the length of lockdown in Melbourne versus New York, and what was the sacrifice and what was the benefit, and we traded some graphs. I mean, tremendous number of lives saved in Australia because of the sacrifice of the community, and that's. There's no real substantive debate about that. But I do think that it is difficult to get that message out because and this is a much longer discussion, but the impacts of social media and how 12 people in the United States can drive the anti-vax discussion on Twitter. 12 people can drive the anti-vax discussion on Twitter, a platform that 60 million people are on. This is a problem because the truth dies in that kind of situation, and the media is under attack, and so there are tough times. But I think we have credibility. I think the emergency services sector has credibility, what we say. But even that, even the public health agencies, because there were so many rapid changes in the early part of the pandemic, and things changed so quickly. I think they should have done a better job of managing people's expectations that things would change. The first thing that should have come out of their mouths was, I'm going to tell you something right now, and next week I'm going to tell you something different, and you have to just get used to that, because we're learning as we go. And don't tell me I'm contradicting myself. I'm learning, and so we're going to learn together, and you're going to hear everything I know and everything I don't know. And again, I think that's something that Andrew Cuomo did well. Great leaders do that well. I think the New Zealand Prime Minister does that well. But these great leaders, I don't know where they all are. There's Angela Merkel is leaving, and there's just not a lot. The air is getting thin up there, I think.
Our final question is from Mal McCann, who says, is it fair to say that the longer it is between the need for response, the greater the gap will be in the bottom-up, top-down synergy in organisations?
I think it is. I think that brick wall gets thicker and tougher and more impenetrable with time, and that is our challenge, right? And we what do they say? You're cursed to live in quiet times, and I think none of us are cursed, because we do not live in quiet times. But you're right. The longer that you go without a crisis, the worse it is for us in terms of convening our stakeholders.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly, for your presentation today, and thank you to everybody watching. And I'm sorry the time's run out for us a little bit, because there were still quite a few people who had questions that they wish to ask. Our next webinar will be on the 24th of November, and we'll be hosting a panel discussion on the recently published EMPA principles, the seat at the table. This will be the final of our webinars for 2021, as we all have a much needed holiday season approaching. But we'll be returning at the end of February next year, in the lead up to our 2022 conferences in March in New Zealand and May in Sydney in Australia. So that presentation in next month is not to be missed. Please keep your eye on your inbox and on our EMPA website for all of the latest news. And once again, Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation today. We're so grateful that you've given up your time over there this evening in New York.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much.